Well, Darren and I had a three-part financial services institutions. Is that what FSI stands for?
Yep, that's right.
Webinar series that wrapped up
Yep.
last week, and I thought it'd be fun to have like a little after. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a party, but a little after show where we'd kind of go over some just a little recap of what we did for fun. But then also there's one big topic we didn't really discuss in depth, which I think would be good to go over. And then first of all, you should obviously whether you're watching this live or the replay of it, you should obviously see the original. But if you haven't, you can find a link to the series, like in the little notes that we have, and also I put it in the chat that we have there. But just look in the description for it. But well, first of all, why don't you introduce yourself, Darren, in case people haven't watched our series?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Darran Rice. I'm working in VMware, the Tanzu part of VMware, which is the modern apps and developer experience part of the company. Before that, though, I worked in financial institutions, mainly banking for best part of 24 years. Um, and most recently, I was a customer. I ran the sort of global middleware and application hosting for UBS, the Swiss bank, for the whole organization. And as part of that, I was a Tanzu customer amongst other kind of platforms. So I have a bit of a background in these kinds of topics. So thanks for having me again, and
Yeah,
looking forward to wrapping this up.
yeah, exactly. And it was that's your background is I mean, that's what made doing the series great is I have very limited knowledge that's specific, very general knowledge of things. And so it was especially nice like talking through and planning things out because we could just I don't know, I could actually learn something, which is always very encouraging. And yeah, anyway, I'm Kote. If you're watching this from someplace other than my usual places, and I work on the developer advocate team, and I spend a lot of time studying how large organizations are, I guess, just getting better at software. That's really the tiniest way of putting it. Well, so the three parts we had, just to summarize them, we had one part which I guess we decided it was going to be like our innovation part, just doing sort of like new development and things like that. And then the second part that we did was really focusing on like how to deal with like legacy software and tech debt and things like that. And then finally we wrapped it up by discussing security and compliance regulations, which is important for every company, but especially so for banks. So starting with like the first one, I think I had I don't know. I had this premise going in that was interesting to kind of test out with you to see if it was true, which is I was just reflecting on myself as a layman in this space, as someone using retail banking, and also someone who had been doing marketing and I guess still is in this area since 2015. And way back in 2015, I remember hearing that all these fintech techs, these little banking startups, were going to like quash the traditional banking world and insurance world and all of this. They were going to do something crazy dramatic. And as we were putting together this stuff, I was thinking like, well, all the big banks are still around. They don't seem to have disappeared. Now, some of them have disappeared or merged because of purely banking things, but certainly not technology things. So much like certainly not from this kind of like innovator's dilemma type of force that was coming in there. And yeah, I mean, I think you having worked in banking and finance through all those years, you had some interesting feedback on that theory.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The reason why banks have failed is a lot of to do very different things, more on the actual banking side of it, whether it's you know not hedging enough or whether it's badly running your risk portfolio from a banking perspective, not necessarily how the technology has affected um, the organization. However, there's also it's not an all or nothing. It's not a kind of the banks haven't
Mm.
just completely stood still, right? And I think that's the point, is that they've had to react, whether they did that because they were maybe more thought leaders in the space and decided to innovate early, or whether they realized they had to do it because of all the fintechs that were coming along. At the end of the day, most of the banks have now moved on. They have, you know, we were just talking in one of the first sessions around, you can't imagine doing work with a bank that didn't have some kind of mobile banking, or within that mobile banking application that it had authentication based on biometrics, things like that. You couldn't really
Yeah.
imagine banks going for much longer without even doing that, right? So banks have been investing time and effort in this, and that's meant that they're largely, if you look at the profits of banks, if you look at their share prices, they haven't been massively impacted. But I think it was still, that doesn't mean that customers haven't gone to these smaller banks. I tend to, for example, I have both, right? I have my
Mm.
standard bank, and I have my startup bank that happens to be useful in certain areas, like if I'm abroad or if I want to get a loan quickly or something like that. It just hasn't got the volume, and it's typically in low margin kind of industries that they've managed to sort of get a bit of the market. So, but the point is that over those last 7-8 years, the big banks, they've had to put a lot of time and effort. They haven't done a blockbuster video. There's a conception that they've sat there just sort of not worrying about these banks as not even something that's relevant to do. It is something they had to do, and largely they've done it to varying degrees, right? But the consequence is they've spent a lot of their budget doing that, right, and a lot of their time and effort, which means they maybe haven't tackled some of the other stuff that we've talked about, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And my I think my addition to that is I was thinking as we were doing this series, I actually have some background that is applicable. That the first company I worked at was like an online banking startup in the late '90s, selling to, of all people, like small community banks in Texas, and it is, you know, they not all of. I often wonder why they bought stuff from us. Not because it was bad, it was great, but just like there was not that same sense of urgency that I think banks felt from these startups back in the late '90s. It was just sort of like, that might be cool, right? To
Right.
have online banking, there was like no threat. But yeah, no, I agree with you that, like, and that's what was, pushing me towards that theory, is that, to put it another way, that large existing banks did respond appropriately, right? Like it was one of these cases where this notion of the innovator's dilemma, where you have a disruptor, which, the orthodox definition of that basically means you have a smaller competitor enter the market at a cheaper price with a less featureful product. And so it allows them to enter the market, because if you're a big company, it's almost like, to summarize a whole lot of stuff, it's like not worth your time to like compete with them. But then eventually, this smaller company gets enough customers and momentum that it almost becomes too late for the big companies. But I remember there was some quote from Jamie Dimon many years ago in the annual JPMC thing, where it was basically like, "Oh yeah, we know what's happening here, and we're doing a lot about it." I mean, it was much more cleverly put than that, but it's a positive sign. And something that you just added that I think was interesting was, it almost feels like that good response like raised the budgets that banks have, and the expectations, right? Like, now we understand, hopefully, that we need to spend money on customer experience and features, and like actually adding new things to our banks, which I think, reflecting on it again from a retail banking customer perspective, even like with the banks that I use, they do seem to have been adding new features. Maybe not as much as those like internet banks you were talking about, which is another ponderous discussion for another time. Which would be fun, is like, why, why are those small banks like have just enough new features and like capabilities, and why don't the big banks just add that to them? But whatever. We'll solve that riddle one day, or maybe just keep using the small banks. It's good to have, you don't only want a spatula with no holes in it. Sometimes you want a slotted spatula. You need multiple things there. But as you were alluding to, the second thing that we talked about, which I think, and you were kind of bridging to it nicely, is you know, it's well, easy is the wrong word, but relatively it's possible and easy to put new features out or new software, new services. But something that is not unique to banking, but certainly most large banks, in fact, all of them, have this issue more so than other organizations, is dealing with all of your existing services and software, your IT, your legacy stuff. And as we did some defining of what legacy was, right? But just to use my little overly clever definition, right? Like it's whatever existing software services you have that you need to change, but you're afraid to change for various reasons, right? Because
Right.
otherwise, if you weren't afraid, you would just call it your software. You only call it legacy if it's for some reason difficult to change, and it's something that I think all financial organizations have a lot of is legacy issues.
Yeah, I think again, it's not exclusive to finance, but of course, as we discussed, they're old. A lot of these companies are old, and they've been there from the start. Some of the first companies to use mainframes and whatever. So they've still got those kind of systems in place. Is one aspect. So they've gone through all the different times, and then also the nature of the business. I think we also touched on things like, you don't tend to turn things off you easily, and that's not just from an infrastructure or software perspective. It's from a business perspective. You don't tend to back out of mortgages. You don't
Right.
back out of life assurance very easily. You have to replace it with something. Otherwise, you've got customers that have got nowhere to go. And you have to keep things like cash points and tills running, even though you maybe don't want to, but while also doing mobile banking and all the new stuff, and then all the trading that you have to do now. If you're an investment bank, you've got to keep that going as well. So you end up with the number of applications grows as well as the infrastructure. And of course, whilst you're competing with these challenger banks and investing all the money there and trying to go fast here, you're just building a bigger and bigger tail of legacy, which then prevents you innovating when you need to change some of those systems, because even the new stuff tends to talk to the old stuff, right? The systems of record, whilst all the front ends and interfaces with the customer often are on new type of technology, the systems of record are very often in these organizations still on quite legacy systems. So then you get these kind of legacy ways of interfacing between them, like file transfers and old messaging systems
Mm.
um, those kinds of tightly coupled kinds of interfaces between the new and the old. So suddenly, if you want to make a change, you can't just do it in the mobile app. You've got to do something back on the mainframe or something very very old as well, right?
Yeah, I forget. I forget if we when we were planning this stuff out, we were planning like the tail of the file transfer, like core
Right.
banking system. Which I forget if we got around to that, but like that is like that's a great ridiculous but true like example of everything most everything we talked about and that you were just going over like one. I mean, I think one of the interesting like things I hadn't thought of that until we started talking about it is like it makes sense once you hear it. But yes, in like finance, one of the main issues you have with like modernizing is that you can't get rid of businesses, right? And the most extreme example is like if you sell someone life insurance, like you can't just decide to change that, right? Like and therefore the business rules that you're using that are in software, just the whole existence of that type of that business as represented by the software and the data that you have, you can certainly change it around and migrate it, but it has to be pretty much exactly the same or there's big problems. Like that's the whole point of life insurance is something that we agreed on, like hopefully whatever, it doesn't have to happen, but something that we agreed on 40 years ago is exactly the same, not changed or weird. And I think it's you can think about across various financial institutions where they don't have the luxury when it comes to their software of changing how the software works if it changes how the business works. It has to kind of preserve what's there. And so, I guess to use the technical term, they can refactor it, but they can't like rewrite it necessarily.
Yeah, they can't necessarily get out of the business or switch the app off. It's not their choice if you're running the app. I think, and again, that's why as well when we talk about modernizing applications,
Mm.
um, which obviously we do a lot of work with lots of organizations to do that. It isn't just, oh, okay, stick it in the cloud or put it in a container, right? Because it's like,
Yeah.
well, if you're still using some old protocol, some old transfer mechanism, some got to talk back to some system, that isn't necessarily, you actually might make it even worse by just putting it in a container or something like that, right? You've got to look at the whole end to end. You've got to look at how systems communicate. At some point, you've got to tackle that fundamental problem, which is you're still relying on 40-year-old back end systems where your systems of record run. And as you said, you're too frightened to touch them because they keep running, right? Now
Right.
we are beginning to start to hear people talk to us about, mainframe exits and things like that. Okay, it's not. I'm focusing on I'm picking on mainframes. I shouldn't, because they're not the only legacy. There's obviously lots of very legacy systems well outside the mainframe as well. But at some point, you've got to take that on. Otherwise, all your other projects will eventually just slow down to the same level of speed that you can go with that system, right? And you get compatibility issues and all these kinds of things, right?
Yeah, and as I think you mentioned there, and this is probably the case with other people, right? But like you end up as the people running IT, whether it's on the development or the operations side, if you don't take care of this, you end up spending 40-50%, maybe even most all, to use that precise phrase, of your time just dealing with this stuff, right? Just keeping it up and running and monitoring it and things like that. So it can be, it pairs up nicely with the first topic because like you've got to balance these two things, right? You've got to maintain what you currently have so that you can spend time doing new things.
And I think what we also touched upon is the concepts of, don't think that legacy means end of life necessarily. There is
Mm.
end of life, and that's a sort of, you accept, you'll have some kind of risk posture on whether how much end of life you are allowing your organization. Typically, it's not your critical applications or your probably directly customer facing, but you'll have lots of other applications that you may have a different risk posture on. And no one expects you to keep an end of life system secure and compliant because you can't, right? But there's a whole load of other stuff in the middle that's in life, right? It's still legacy because of the way you run it, right? You still run it in a very traditional way. You
Mm.
patch it over 10 years. You make delta change. You have 7 or 8 different ways of making change, and so then you've never really know what's running, and then all the problems that then comes with, right? Um, so a lot more of the effort is actually on that middle ground between, your sort of new cloud native type applications and your end of life applications. It's all the middle ground, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and that's a good segue to the third one you brought up. A lot of what you just said there came up during the third part that we did, the security and compliance part. And just to go immediately to it, right? Like this idea, right? Like one aspect of, well, a big aspect of security is like essentially patching your software in production, whether that's fixing the configuration that you have or deploying like security bug fixes or things like that. And you were just going over, but one of the things that you brought up that I hadn't thought a lot about was this idea of in the non-cloud native way of doing a lot of production management, you are just like layering and layering on things because that is the safest way to do it, right? Rather than just like reinstalling everything, right? Like who knows if that'll work. But and then you can kind of that is closely related to the legacy issue of like as you were just saying, if you do that year on year on year, you can't really do anything else. And you've just got, you've got the metaphoric giant ball of like foil that you've just been layering on top, and then you need a piece of foil and it's hard to pull it off of it. I'll have to work on that metaphor there a little bit, but it's
yeah,
nonetheless, there it is. But in a more cloud native way, right? Like it encourages basically just reinstalling stuff. Like it's kind of built into the way that container-based architectures and Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry and other things like that work, which gives you new security capabilities. But I think the other interesting part of the security and compliance part was kind of your explanation. And this is one of those things where, like, if you work in financial institutions, it makes sense. But I think it's, if you don't, it's worth going over. But sort of like your take on how core security and compliance is to banks, even more. I mean, to financial organizations, even more so than maybe other organizations.
Well, yeah, because there's a couple of reasons. One is tend to be more regulated. Again, this could also be true of other regulated industries, but all the financial industries are heavily regulated, and that then means that regulated isn't just a piece of paper that someone says, "Oh, okay, we'll have to follow this." It comes with inspections, audits. It comes with demonstration of what to show that you are adhering to those regulations, right? And so what people don't often realize is the amount of time you spend demonstrating your compliance and security,
Mm.
whether that's often they'll have an internal audit, which is your first line of defense, but they'll spend a lot of their time auditing you internally. And then you'll have an outside audit, so you can then demonstrate that you're compliant to auditors and regulators, right? Um, and that takes up, particularly with traditional software, an absolutely huge amount of time. And it would be interesting what people think, how much time they spend on that, right? I know it took a lot of my time. I think we asked that question in the third session, right? um Obviously there's also the fact that the banks and insurance companies and that they hold very sensitive data, and we're talking about money here, right? Large amounts of money often, so any compromise, you know could result in fraud. It encourages criminal activity. It encourages, you know, so therefore you have to have a lot of aspects around the people in the compliance. That's another aspect that people think security is always what SSL certificates we're using, or I should say TLS now, shouldn't I? But I'm sure people are still using the SSL protocol, um, or calling it that, even if they realize they're actually on TLS. But there's a lot of focus on the sort of technical side of security, and then, but once you work in one of these kinds of organizations, you realize there's a people element to the security, because at the end of the day, they've got the keys. They are the administrators and operators, right? They can get in a different way. It doesn't matter if you lock down, the HTTPS port that applications are coming in on, if an operator can go in the back door and do whatever they want. So I think in terms of having those systems that are, when you look at cloud native, that are immutable, right, that don't allow operators to log on, to separating out the control plane from the data plane, from only allowing the minimum amount of access that anyone requires, it just allows you to be much more able to demonstrate that people didn't change things, mess with things, that the source of truth is still what is, what was built is what is running, right? So there's a whole element of things. If you do things in a cloud native way, it allows you to demonstrate to the auditor that it's more compliant, and it allows you to remove certain access levels that people need, so you don't have to worry about so much about what they're doing, and monitoring and logging their activities, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, exactly. And what you're bringing up is the difference between perimeter security and everything else, right? And like
But
the, as you were saying, like
well,
the simple idea of security is just like, don't let people in, right? But I think, especially when you're talking about application developers and doing software, right? Like, you need to make sure not only that you don't have bad actors in there, who are trying to get any things. The mythical, not mythical because it was based on in truth, but the old, let's shave pennies off of ATM transaction people from Office Space in real life, like those fanciful, delightful tales. But there's plenty of other actual bigger problems that you have, and I think as you were getting to, right, like, it's there's two things that in going through this I was realizing. One, that like, well, I mean, I'll combine them together, but it is useful when you look at the cloud native architectures and things. There's a useful aspect to them being new and built from the ground up, and that is that they seem to have a lot more security controls in them, or a lot more different ways. It's a lot more open way of doing security, right? So it's kind of easier to program that in and put it into your process of doing stuff. That was very well put on my part. But then also I think the again that the ability to essentially that's built in to isolate all these different parts of how software gets out the door from each other is very powerful as well, right? Like it's almost you have to go out of your way to actually do something malicious if you're just following the very basics of how you're deploying things, which is nice for security. So, speaking of like the platform, so the thing that we didn't really talk about very much, we of course alluded to it here and there, and like good people, we were like, you should talk with us here at VMware if you want to learn more about the technology and practices that underpin this. But we didn't talk a lot about something that I think you and I talk a lot about in other contexts, and you've actually done work on, and that is so we've alluded to the cloud native architectures that you have. We're putting a platform in place that you use to run your applications, and I think the way that you think about and you run a platform that is sort of we could call it the runtime environment and all the integrated services and middleware and kind of application development frameworks, like all the goopy stuff underneath the actual application you're using is this platform. But the way that you think about building and running that platform nowadays is different than the traditional way of delivering infrastructure and operations. And I think you know it'd be good. What we wanted to talk about in the rest of this little fireside after show thing here is like what that looks like, because I think that is we went over a lot of like what needs to change and the mindset that needs to change. But I think arguably one of the biggest things that you change in kind of going to cloud native way of doing stuff is having this platform in place. And so like walk us through. You had a great chart in our past VMware Explorer last year, where you were kind of going over what is the operational mindset shift between service delivery, if you will, and platform as a product.
Yeah, so platform as a product is a term that's coming back. Actually, it's been around for quite a while, but people are realizing platform engineering and those kinds of things is coming back. I think it's about if you think about a few different areas, it's like, let's say how does a new request for an application to get onto the platform or get a new platform happen, right? And in a traditional way, it would be very ticket based. It would be, raise me a ticket, and then someone would go and approve it, and then they would go and do something. Maybe that was manual, maybe parts of it were automated, but then they would come back, and very often they would give you a piece. So that might be you go and order a VM, and then you say, right, I now need to raise another ticket for the firewall rule or the whatever else, and then you're not giving back a complete solution to whoever's ordering. Whereas obviously when you start thinking about having a platform that's actually based on what someone wants, it's moving it up to a sort of service catalog order item that you can order, and you don't order at the give me an IP address or give me a VM or give me a whatever level. You define a platform to consume, right? And the request, hopefully it's self-service, right? Hopefully there's a list of different options, and within that service you're asking people only the things that they can answer. I mean, the other problem with a ticketed approach, when you go down to that technical level, is you're asking people things they don't know, right?
Right.
What's the name of the firewall you would like this IP address to be changed in? I mean, how do I know? I know it needs to go from over here to over here, right? So it's trying to elevate it up to abstracting away the things that people couldn't possibly know. Something I was talking about last week was about when we talk about developer toil, developer time to market, and things like that. A lot of people are thinking, oh, it's because they're having to spend time learning how to code new infrastructure as code or YAML or whatever, and that is part of it. A lot of it is also trying to work out what information they have to provide to order the thing that they need, which they can't
Right.
possibly know because a person who runs the platform has asked it in whatever ordering form it is, right? Um, and that's natural because they think they need to know it, right? And they do need to know it, but they can't necessarily ask the customer what that is. So part of this sort of, think about when you're ordering a product, and we think about running a platform as a product. Think about when you're ordering a product online. If you're buying an iPhone or whatever you're doing, right? If they asked you nonsensical questions that you couldn't have any clue how to answer, you just wouldn't buy it, right? If
Right.
they, it's about moving that question, having a certain amount of opinionated templates, right? Now you might not have one, you may have a few, but you sort of, and you answer the questions within that, and you offer, let's say, t-shirt sizes or different options that an application can actually understand, right? And you offer it at that level, right? And you offer 2 or 3 options. That is that to me is one of the most important entry points for when you're running your platform as a product. Is what is your service catalog look like? How do people even know about that service catalog, and how are they coming to it? And then when they're in it, they should have a self-service automated way of consuming your platform, and it should be abstracted to a level where they're only answering questions that they can answer. Right? That's the first. That's one of the first points. So maybe if you want to
Yeah, and
opine on that, yeah.
I think you're covering a large part of the product part. There is thinking about, it's well, I mean, it's product thinking. It's like, I have a customer, and then this is the first sort of like mindset shift you have to go through, and my customer is the developers, right? Like, and as opposed to like, the traditional service delivery thinking that I learned way back when was, my customer is is responding to the request appropriately, right? And it's not necessarily, I mean, obviously no one would say like, whether or not I succeed, give the people what they want or not, it doesn't matter. I've just given them what they ask. Like, there's always good intentions with this stuff. But just by thinking of this idea that you're only responding to the request, as opposed to really just like helping out the developers, figuring out what they need and seeing how you can provide it to them. And like, I like your the analogy of buying a laptop or a phone or whatever, right? Like, there's the style of buying a laptop where or a phone where you're confronted with a bunch of like letters and acronyms and numbers about like the stuff that you're getting in there. Or it could just be like, do you want this to work on Wi-Fi or on a cellular network? Like, you don't necessarily tell people like what all those choices are. And so, one, there's that better, well, I guess you could call it customer experience, but user experience to think about, instead of having those forms you were going over. But two, there's also like this push in how you run platforms to actually change things more frequently, right? Like instead of knowing every 12 months what it is, having a static idea of the services that you have, in the ideal state of things, like with the platform, I don't know, every month, every 2 months, you could actually add to or change the features that the platform has, change what's in there, so that as you work and understand what developers need more and more, just like with the product, just like you would expect the developers to do with their applications, you can add newer features in there and build that into the system. And I think, again, not that it was intended this way, but the way that most, I think, IT service management and service delivery stuff has ended up manifesting itself is, it just takes 12 months to do the planning and the budgeting and like, have the meetings about whether you can do it or not. And then once you're on that kind of like annual cycle of stuff, you're not really responsive to very much at all.
Right. I think you've touched on a couple of things there. I think one is how you fund things, right? Because typically you fund things historically in a project way, and you say, would it be a good idea if we did this? And you go, right, let's wait for the budget cycle for the project, start a project up and then do it. And that might take however long your project budget cycle runs. Whereas when you're running things more as a product that's got continuous investment in it, you have a sort of set of money that you charge back from the customer each you could cross charge internally back, and part of that needs to be put back into innovation R&D on the platform, right? And the way that you find that out, if you're then running it more with a customer mindset, is having forums, having a community, having regular check-ins and asking people what they want. Obviously, you've got to try and monitor that a little bit. Everyone can't have everything that they want, right? There's the old, camel is a horse designed by committee thing, right? But so you can't just give everybody what they want. But at least if you go to forums where people can put their ideas in and people can upvote for different things, and if you get enough of a quorum of people that want a certain feature, you can build it. Whereas I think the traditional way is you wait for the first person to come along and who thinks they might want something. They have to come with a project, and then they say, okay, we'll go and get the money and build that. I mean, can you imagine if a shop ran like that? If you opened a bakery with nothing in it and you waited for the first person to come in and
Right.
say, I'd like some bread, you go, hey, that's a good idea. Let's work out how we make bread. We'll be back to you in 3 months, right? Whereas if you'd surveyed your customers in advance, go, it sounds like lots of people like bread. Maybe we should have loads waiting for them when they come in. Right?
Right,
So,
right.
so it's that kind of proactive, you know, proactively talking to your customers, right, about what the consensus of them needs, not these bespoke little funny things because they're the most important application ever, right? But what most people need, and the more different groups of developers you talk to, the more you'll get a general feel for what is genuinely something they need versus a sort of a quirk. And then just building that into your regular release cycles. So like any product, right? Every product that you sell, like the iPhone brings out the next one, right? It doesn't do that because you rang them up and said, "Can I have some other feature, please?" And they go, "Oh, that's a good idea." They obviously do surveys, they do market research, and then they bring out the iPhone 15, and it has some of that stuff in it, right?
Yeah,
So that,
and I think you're reminding me of something a little jokey conversation I had with someone once, which was they were describing this was some years ago, but they were describing doing like running a platform, like everything you were just going over, and I was thinking like what you're doing sounds like you're an enterprise architect, except like you actually write code. To be unfair to the enterprise architect thing, but it's sort of like a lot of what in the best case like an enterprise architect is trying to do, it's one of the things that they often lack is the ability to like implement it, right? Like direct control over like, and now we're going to build the thing. Whereas, a lot of what a platform is almost like the implementation of not only what an enterprise architect would do, but also what an operations person would do, right? Like it's almost combining those two things together into one role instead of keeping them separate, which seems good, essentially.
yeah, I think we talked about this a while, maybe not on this series, but it's changing the role from like sort of a traditional engineer or operator who will focus on technical reasons to change the platform, right?
Mm.
Because, for example, you might say, "Oh, we want to support. We're changing our strategy because the CTO said we now want to go from product A to product B," and that's the reason why you made a change to the platform. Um, you now go, well, actually, we've been asked to support this feature by the customers, right? And actually, we've got enough customers to realize it is a legitimate request. Let's build that into the next release, right? Rather than going, oh, Kafka's on everyone's mind at the moment. We should have Kafka in here for some reason, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, just because like everyone thinks that's what we should be doing. Yeah, it's a different kind of trying to move away from the sort of technology. Obviously, we need to have technology conversations. Obviously, lots of new technology comes out all the time, and that technology can be an enabler, but it should be an enabler for something that the business actually wants to do, rather than let's try and find a way of using this new tech. Right?
So like talk to me about experience that you've had, and nowadays conversations with other people where they're trying to transform the way they think about infrastructure and operations to this platform way, right? Like how do you see people going through that transformation, and more importantly, like planning it out? Like how that's a big shift. So I imagine like kind of just like with your bread analogy, right? Like it's good to have some idea ahead of time that you probably should be serving bread, and it's nice to know how other people have kind of gone through this change.
So it doesn't happen overnight is the first point, right? So everyone's might be thinking, oh, you're talking about this completely. We're so far away from that, it never happens. And when anyone starts, if they're not doing any of this thinking of platform as a product yet, it's going to take a while. So you just need to bite off. We had different maturity levels of what people are doing, right? So just starting off with the idea of putting your list of what you are offering in one place. Yeah. Just starting somewhere, right? Because at the moment, I imagine you've probably got, if you're not thinking in this way, the way that you order, I don't know, a desktop is probably completely different to the way you order a database, which is probably completely different to the way you interface with the network team, right?
Yeah.
So just number one is creating the concept of we're going to create a service catalog of platforms and things that we want to offer, right? And it doesn't have to be very sophisticated because on day one, you're just collating it and everyone knows that's where I go to get my stuff. This is how I get my application, the things it needs, right? And it could be some people behind that to start with to get it up and running, right? When you get into later maturity things, you probably don't want people ordering network things, right? You probably want the network things to come as part of a higher level service. So, for example, we were talking the other day, like I want 2 VMs with a load balancer. Okay, that would traditionally would have been 4 or 5 tickets, right? And you take the output of one and put it into another. As you go up the sophistication curve, you can say, let's put all that together in one workflow, and we take the output of the VM creation and stick the load balancer into the load balance request and automate that. You don't have to do that on day one, right? That's just that you get there over time. I think the other thing is around building a community around it. It doesn't have to be all about how you technically do these things, right? So having rather than everything having to be done via a ticket, you build a community using whatever your chat tool is, Slack or Teams or whatever it is, right? Because then you can have people talking about it. I'm not saying you're ever going to replace tickets completely. You still need tickets for certain things, incidents, you know, if it's a piece of work that drags on for a period of time, you need a ticket. But if it's just, hey, I heard there's this new service offering or there's a new product version, or what's going on? I just need to get started. Can someone please help me? Right? Those kinds of things can really help by having a community behind it and having your team won't scale to answer every developer's question in the organization, but other people will. Yeah. So hearing other application teams answer the questions of other application teams on how to adopt a platform is brilliant, right? Because
Yeah, and I think
you can step out of the way, right?
I think I mean just to interject briefly, like I think this community and marketing aspect is like one of the biggest shifts or biggest new things that I see people having to take on, because whether it's like knowledge bases and things like that and kind of service delivery and ITEL based stuff, like the idea of kind of actively going out and marketing, I well, at least in my experience, isn't really done very much in IT. But again, it falls out from part of that like product mentality, right? Like if you have a product, you need marketing. Like especially in something as thrilling as IT.
Well, I think marketing has existed in a different way, but it's about understanding what people care about when you market. I think in the tradition, people have always had town halls and big, things where they announce what they've been doing for the last 3 years. But it's often been like, oh, look, we built 50,000 databases, right? Or, we put 300 applications into the cloud. It's not really the stuff that, okay, it's nice to know that that's what's been happening, but that isn't really marketing what you're doing. You're just telling people what you've done and that you're going to continue to build another 50,000 databases and possibly put another 20,000 apps into the cloud. You need to change it to kind of, hey, did you know that we're building a community? Did you know that we are having these regular sessions where you can come and you can actually talk to us about what you want, not just be told 3 months later, this is what we've been doing, locked away in a different building for 3 years, right? I think there are always places that these, that's gone on forever. It's not that people don't necessarily talk to each other, but I think it's trying to get yourself onto those kinds of big audiences and big forums with these new kinds of topics, right? And putting these ideas forward when traditionally that may have been reserved for much more technical conversations or much more sort of let's call it, statistics cheering or whatever, or whatever
Right.
I'm trying to think of a name for, like, celebrating that we've hit a certain number.
Yeah. No. And speaking of that, like one of the things in that overview you gave a while ago is like what's the change in mentality for like metrics or gauges, like for the statistics cheering, as you were saying, like what like what are the existing type of ways of measuring, and also measuring in the sense of just checking on your status, knowing how you're doing, right? And contrasted with like a more of a platform way of doing it.
I think traditional operations teams have used things like percentage uptime, right? And then obviously things like numbers of tickets, right? And I think that's always an interesting one because no one's really working out the quality of those tickets, the
Right.
severity of those tickets, what the importance of those tickets were, right? So just saying we closed 100,000 tickets, um, those are the kinds of um, things that people have traditionally in operations and infrastructure. I think obviously cost has always been there. So to say that we've reduced cost by X has always been a metric that people do um, do measure, but I think it's been often this is the cost that we've just taken off the bottom line of purely the infrastructure bit, not necessarily the total cost of ownership, right?
Yeah.
Which would
Yeah. Yeah.
include the time it takes developers or applications to use it and things like that. And I think what we were trying to move to, or what I encourage people to move to when I talk to them now, is you know have your KPIs or OKRs set, and that's how you drive behavior. By the way, we've talked about that before as well, right? But to get your operations teams operating in a different way, you set their goals and behaviors in a way that says, how many service reviews did you have with your customers this month? Right? Is your roadmap up to date up to the last 3 years? Right? What was the time it took to actually deliver a service, if that's important to you? Right? And change those kinds of things. Right? Try and put SLAs around, well, SLAs that mean something. I mean, I've seen SLAs where they go, "Oh, the SLA to deliver this machine is 120 days." I mean, at that point, it doesn't even really matter whether you hit it or not, right? because even hitting it is not great, right? So I think changing those kinds of metrics to things the customer cares about, right? And you think about when someone orders something, what do they care about? They don't care about the fact that you've done 99,000 of these ones before and that you are one customer number 100,000 of the VM ordering system, right? They don't care about that, right? They probably do care that you've got a good uptime percentage, but they probably just expect that now to be 99.99 whatever, right? They care about, and if you, again, think about it as a product that you're ordering yourself on the internet. What do you care about? What is the spec of the thing I'm ordering? What does it look like? How much does it cost? And when am I going to get it? Right. So if you put the KPIs around that, right, then suddenly it drives that mindset of that's what they care about. That's what we should be aiming
Mm.
for.
Yeah. Yeah. I like your also an idea just like of if you're shifting to doing things in a product mentality, to use one thing you're saying, like one of the you want to have metrics that tell you the status and how you're doing around product management, right? And so like thinking about how long, I mean, obviously at some point you have to make your metrics adaptive, otherwise you fall into whoever's law it is. But like, how long does it take us to clear out our backlog, or like how long, how there probably is some product management way of thinking about this, but you want to make sure you're actually like implementing new features, right? So like for an item in your backlog, a feature that you want to give to developers, and once you've chosen it, how long does it take to like deliver it, right? And then what's kind of the throughput that you have for delivering new features? To your point, right? Like if something takes 120 days, you should just don't worry about measuring it unless it gets to 121. Right? Like it's such a
even then, you've probably forgotten when you ordered it, and
exactly.
and what's the punishment for getting it one day after 120? It's not the point, right? I think it's about, if that was the SLA for ordering something off Amazon, you wouldn't order it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. It just needs to totally be readjusted. Well,
And I think that's a good thing around your platform as well, because you've got to
yeah.
sell your platform, but it's got to be something that the application team really wants to use, right? And they'll go and find that shadow IT exists because of ridiculous SLAs on things like you can't deliver your platform or whatever it is in a sensible amount of time. That's why people go and do it themselves, and shadow IT exists, right? You've got to make the platform compelling. You've got to make it a product that people want to buy at the end of the day, to keep pushing the product analogy, right?
Totally. Yeah, and you reminded me last week on the Tanzu Talk podcast, like Ben and I, who are on there, we were talking about platform marketing and like community management and advocacy, things like that. A lot of the things you've touched on here. And one of the things I was thinking through as last week when we were talking about it is well, I mean, shadow IT is one of it, but like again, in a product mentality, you think about who your competition is. And you know, competition inside a large organization when it comes to platforms and the services that your application developers use is a little different than it is in like the open market. But it's not that different, right? Because often there are multiple platforms someone can choose from that are, fully sanctioned, supported platforms. And then you also are competing with people building out a new platform or doing something on their own. But then there's also like just the competition of like, there's this, I don't really know what type of competition there is, but there's the competition of they've selected your platform and they don't like it. So they're just doing a bad job. Right? Like there's not like the enthusiasm, or there's not the minimum amount of enthusiasm needed to like understand how the platform wants you to think, the features that it has, and how you can best use it. So even in that case, there's this amount of doing platform marketing where you've got to like get people interested in using it. Otherwise, you're not going to like be successful at it, right? Like you're going to spend all this time on a platform, and if people don't use it well, it's not going to matter, even if they're not subverting it.
Yeah, that also comes back to what other options do they have? If you're also running one of the other options, and you want to make your new platform the most, the chosen one, then that comes back to sort of maturity levels on the service catalog, and do you add decision trees and things like that to steer people? It shouldn't be. I was having a conversation with one large bank, and it was around how they sort of structure, how they get people to use certain platforms, right? Because there was multiple platforms and they were competing, right? Um, the point is, it shouldn't be the first platform that happens to contact you is the one you use. Yeah. Why did you use this platform? Oh, because they contacted me. So they it goes back to that sort of, where do you start? How do you encourage people to use which platform, right? And that might be cost incentive, it might be time, and it might even be that you want to retire another platform, so you push people towards another one. And there's all sorts of ways, which we're not going to have loads of time to talk about now, but it's around incentivizing people to use your platform, and there's there's carrots and sticks ways of doing it, right? So it's, do you put the price up of the old platform internally versus the new one? Do you make the new one very fast and more flexible, and all those kinds of things, right? But I think it can get a bit dangerous doing competition where you just say we're in direct competition with a team that sits next to you, to the point where you wouldn't even encourage an application that's suitable for that platform to go there, even though they should, because when
Right,
you go
right.
when you go up to the top of the tree, that's bad, right?
Yeah, no, no,
That,
that is. I'm always a little, I don't know, saddened when I hear about like platform politics inside large organizations. Like it seems like it would be, you know, I don't know, in everyone's interest just to have people pick the platform that works for them. But there's often a bunch of, as we know, being on the vendor side, who's often involved in these weird platform politics. There's I don't know, not really helpful for anyone, but they come up. Well, one of the things that I think you pioneered in this series was Darren's simple question to make you think at the end of each one, which I thought was great. It was like we kind of crafted over these past three things, but it's good to kind of end in a very simple like question, or as they used to say, thought exercise that kind of like kind of gives you a next steps, and like so for this one, for our recap, what's Darren's simple thought provoking question, a little managerial tip for daydreaming, shower thoughts as it were.
yeah. So I'm not going to repeat the ones that we already had in the three podcasts, because I think you should just go and watch them, and there's a little ask at the end of each of them. I think this one are we call it a path to production, right? We
Mm.
actually run workshops on this kinds of topic as well, and it's also similar to the kind of, it's going on sort of on top of the golden path that Spotify talk about. But the difference between a path to production and a golden path. A golden path is the definition of the actual opinionated best way to get to production, whereas a path to production is what you currently do and working out what you currently do. So my thought is, whoever's listening, would they, to take away, do you know at the moment how long it actually takes you to go from an application or an application business concept into production, and even what all those steps are, right? Because I think often in large organizations, people don't even know all the steps. They may know their bit, right? But it would be interesting if you know. And if you don't know, it would be great to talk to us, because we talk to customers all the time about this kind of thing, and we actually even run free workshops um, to to try and map out what you do and see how we can help you improve that. So that's my thought for the day. How long is it taking you to get an application live, really?
Exactly, and as you're saying, right? Like, and we've seen this at numerous organizations where you go through this path to production exercise, and you have people from multiple silos, so to speak, who are kind of mapping out this from the idea that the business might have to a person actually using it, and I think oftentimes. Very few people, in fact, I would say most of the time, no single person in that room has ever gotten that full view of things, right? And I think that having that full view for each of the roles in there, and especially for that, well, especially for all the roles, right? Like it helps them do their part in that a lot better, because they just understand like what's happening with the handoffs, and they can also help each other out by optimizing the way things are done, right? So often, like I think a lot of the um, to use the word for it, if you only know your bit of like a 15-part process, you tend to locally optimize what you're doing, right? Like you make it work really well. And you also tend to like defend yourself against the annoyances of the other parts of the process. And over years, that kind of like encrustifies into a bunch of annoyance, and you get to this vicious cycle. Whereas if everyone can kind of look at the big picture, they can probably start to optimize it a lot more, and make it run a lot better. But yes, as you say, like if you, the audience, are interested in kind of going through or talking about what one of these sessions are, there's a link in the description wherever you find the links for this, and you can sign up to get a little bit of to talk with us about that. And then the other thing, of course, we mentioned, which is also available to click on in the description and areas like that, is you can watch the 3-part talk series they're webinars, but you can click on them and see the series if you want to get into a lot of the details of things that Darren and I just summarized. But is there anything else before we wrap up, Darren, that you want to recap from the series? Like what any other favorite memories you want to bring up?
Just before I do that, yeah, I just see there is a couple of questions on the chat. We won't have time to answer them now, but I'll endeavour to get on to answer them in wherever I can on YouTube or wherever they came from. So apologies, we're not be able to answer it on here. Now, my only final thoughts is that obviously this stuff is complicated, right? These organisations are not dumb. Right, they've not got in this position because they don't have clever people working for them. It's extremely complex. There's a lot to it, but there are modern approaches that can help. And obviously, I talk to these kinds of companies all the time. So if there are people out there that want to know more, this is what we do all day. So and particularly with our domain knowledge, my own personal team come from industry. So if you want to talk to us, reach out. You've got our details, and I'd be happy to have a further conversation. But it's been great fun. So
Yeah.
thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was really nice. I just as a final behind the scenes thing, I was originally just asked to do the series, and pretty immediately it was like I have no idea what I'm going to be talking about, so I'm going to convince Darren to help me so that it's actually good, and it was nice of you to help out with that, and also to underscore it, right? Like Darren's right. We have the team that he's on is a bunch of people like himself who are come from industry or are industry experts, and their focus is more on how do you make all this stuff actually happen in a large organization, not just what that stuff is. Yeah, well, hopefully you've enjoyed the recap, and there's plenty of other exciting stuff. If you liked watching this, if you just go check out our YouTube channel, you can check it out. And with that, we'll see everyone next time. Bye bye.
Bye.